let's start off with kind of how you came to study narcissism, because I understand your initial interest were in kind of the more spiritual side of things, to do with the self, being an illusion. Is that right?
Yeah, it's interesting you heard that, because I've talked to people about that. But when I started in grad school and studying the self, and I wanted to study, the Buddhist self, non-attachment, and anybody who's in the area of self-research, which goes back to William James. I'm being a little technical with your show. I hope it's okay. But anybody in this area ends up studying Buddhism, because the Buddhists were the ones thinking about the self longer than anyone. They have the best philosophy of the self. So I was interested in that, but I couldn't figure out how to study it. People since then have done a very good job looking at some of these issues psychologically. I couldn't do it. But if you turned around and looked at narcissism, you kind of see the ego just going for it. You see how the ego is formed. You see how it's sort of becomes rewarded, how it can grow, how it can crumble. It's just like a very big way to study. In the same way, I think when the early neuroscientists started studying nerves, they would look at like a squid or an eel. There's a squid nerve that was very big. Is that right?
Yeah. I remember the giant squid neuron, and when I was an undergrad, they were at pains to clarify that was a giant neuron from a squid, not a neuron from a giant squid. That they weren't going and wrangling these giant squids.
Yeah. So, but the idea. So when Freud started studying neuroscience, he started studying because it was the easiest one to see. And I think for me, looking at narcissism, it's a very easy way to see the ego in action. But it's not the only way your ego can capture you, and people's egos can control, people can be really communal and loving and spiritual and become very ego focused too. But that's part of the reason, was just to understand the ego from this other perspective.
Right. And it might be worth starting off with a bit of background as to, what exactly narcissism is as a concept in the kind of psychology.
Yeah, so the term is used, I found out, and usually people are using the term day to day as sort of a pejorative word. And sometimes people mean it clinically and sometimes they don't, and they mix it up. So I'm going to try to give you the psychology definitions. There's really 2 or 3 definitions we talk about. The first is when we're talking about narcissism, we're typically talking about a personality trait. And as a trait, it's something that people range on from sort of a high end to a low end. Most people are around the middle, just like something like extroversion or self-esteem or creativity. It's a normal distribution for the most part. And like any trait, there's benefits and costs. Narcissism has good things and bad things to it. In terms of the definition of narcissism, this is where it gets confusing. When we talk about narcissism, you have this sort of sense of superiority that when people think about, you have a positive view of yourself, you're superior to other people with a sense of entitlement and a desire for admiration or positive feedback. So that's the very basic idea. You think you're better than other people, you have a sense of entitlement, maybe lack some empathy, like to get positive feedback from the environment. That's kind of your core definition. But the way that worked out in the field was people ended up, I can go into the history of this, but we ended up talking about 2 different people with the label narcissist. One group of people were sort of entitled, a little bit callous, but were also extroverted, charming, energized, expressive, maybe authoritarian sometimes. And these folks would end up being leaders or bad dating partners or bad bosses, because they were often very attractive, energetic people that would be mean later on. The other form of narcissism was this more vulnerable form, which are people had this sort of same sense of self-superiority, but they didn't have the gumption, the extroversion, the drive to engage with the world. So they became depressed and a little bit unstable and uncertain about themselves, and often have more narcissistic fantasies. So that's this more vulnerable narcissism, sometimes called covert or hidden or basement or shy narcissism. Is kind of the more fragile side. And the challenge was when the clinical folks, the clinical therapists or psychotherapists would see narcissists, they're often seeing the more vulnerable forms, because they're the ones who are like, I'm depressed, I need help. The grandiose forms are running the world, and they're not going into therapy because they're doing pretty well. They do get in therapy sometimes, but generally not. And so what happened was, over time, clinicians started to think, well, all these narcissists deep down must be kind of wounded and vulnerable, or else they wouldn't want to take over the world. Because only person would want to take over the world and be that famous and have all those girlfriends was somebody who's really wounded inside. That's not really the case. Turns out there's two different forms. There's this more vulnerable people, there's the more grandiose people. Some are a little bit of both, but they're very different. They have different backgrounds, different childhoods. Then, to make it a little more confusing, is there's this clinical term, which is narcissistic personality disorder. That is a personality disorder which is clinically diagnosed from extreme narcissism. So you have very extreme narcissism, primarily grandiose, but also some vulnerability. And to make it a disorder, it has to lead to impairment. So if it's not impairing your life in some way, it can't be diagnosed. The impairment might be, with narcissism, it's often, with impairment, we often talk about love and work. With narcissism, what it seems to do is it damages relationships. It can be very toxic, because you're, using people as props for your own glory, and people don't like that, and you can be destructive. And it also can ruin your work because you can't work with people, or you take too many risks, or you do other bad things. So it can be really destructive at that point. But when we're talking about a disorder, we're talking about maybe 1 or 2% of the people. So if you say, Keith, somebody says, Keith, you're such a narcissist. I'm like, what do you mean? Do you mean I'm kind of vulnerable and a little shy and I'm playing video games? Or do you mean I'm kind of an arrogant jerk and, you shouldn't work with me? Or you're saying I've got a clinical disorder and I need to go into therapy and I'm really, really pathological? And it could be any of those things. It's just confusing.
Right. And I think you're, it makes me think of the fact that a lot of conversations around narcissism understandably happen from the extreme side of, people encountering people with disorders who are extremely toxic and pathological. So it's worth probably saying up front, acknowledging the harm that's done there, because a lot of what we're talking about is the science behind it, a kind of, conversation about it as a trait and that kind of thing. And you mentioned kind of positive as well as negatives. So it's worth, I think, just acknowledging that, this is going to be a slightly different kind of conversation, I think, to those kinds of ones.
Right. Because if you look at the interest in narcissism often comes from people who have been victimized, which happens all the time. I mean, I get emails constantly from people with a damaged relationship from somebody who's narcissistic. When people who are been victimized by narcissism come up with a model of narcissists, it's a very negative and destructive and toxic model, because that's what they've experienced of it. They get that one face of it, but they're not seeing the face, like they're not seeing the trade-offs that person deals with, because they're coming out clinically. So when I talk about it from the research, I'm always trying to stay balanced and think about these things as trade-offs, or else I start, I'm trying to be a little bit scientific, is what I'm saying, James, right, without getting too caught up in this stuff and being too judgmental. And these things, if these things exist, they have benefits and costs, and we need to understand those, I think.
Right. And I think that's really, really important, because for me, my interest, like a lot of people in this area, comes from having, been wounded in many ways by a kind of family dynamic that was governed by narcissism. And it's kind of interesting to kind of try to, because that's such an emotionally charged thing, it's interesting to try to kind of engage with it as this like neutral thing. And for me, you mentioned, people build up their own models of it. I have this strong intuition. You mentioned this kind of the idea that you have the vulnerable narcissists and you also have the grandiose ones, but maybe deep down they're vulnerable. For me, and you mentioned, I think in your book, you call this the mask model of narcissism. And that's something that always resonated with me. The relevant axis seemed to be, as far as I could understand it, maybe a subtle form of vulnerability, where it's like, fundamentally, are you the kind of person who thinks you can go out in the world, trust people, be a bit, actually be okay with being vulnerable, and like collaborate with people? Or do you think, no way am I going to risk that? I'm going to engage in manipulation. And, so there's a kind of subtle form of vulnerability that I felt allowed me to make sense of it as a disorder. But I guess that could occur in some cases and not in other cases, maybe.
Well, you can certainly have people that have aspects of really just straight up grandiosity and vulnerability. And so my guess is what's happening here is that you find people that are that are kind of raised, that are more of these grandiose forms, but they get some trauma early on or some of this vulnerability, and then they end up with these defensive structures. You know, you can imagine how somebody can end up with these more psychodynamic structures, being traumatized, but still having the grandiosity. 80% of the time you seem like a really likable, grandiose person, but when you get under stress, you become really mean and, you know, defense. I mean, yes, I can very easily characterize somebody like that. But when you look at the big data sets, we're going to see, well, that's really this person with a piece of this mixed in, if that makes it's sort of somebody grandiose with some toxicity with it, rather than somebody who's just classically grandiose. But yeah, I know what you're talking about.